There is so much rich history in Buffalo that has impacted us, but also the world, right? And I'm here with Buffalo historian Lindsay Visser, who's going to tell us an amazing story about a race from New York City to Paris, all in this car, right?
Yes. Behind us is the Thomas Flyer, and truly this is the car that changed the world.
Okay, take us back to the start. How was this even an idea to do?
It does sound a little crazy, right? New York to Paris. In one direction, you're talking at best 2 continents and an ocean. Opposite direction, you're talking 3 continents and an ocean. Unfortunately for this car, they chose the harder route, and they actually did go across North America with the intention of driving across the frozen Siberian Strait, the Bering Strait. Yes, wow. This was the original plan. Then driving down into Russia through Siberia, crossing Russia, entering into Europe, and finishing the race in Paris, France that way.
Now, who was behind the wheel for this?
Well, we actually were a little bit of a late entry into the race. The Americans were not very well represented in this race. You have to remember at this point, in terms of car culture, the Europeans were very dominant. So initially going into the race, of the 13 teams that had signed up, the majority were European. In fact, the only team to enter from America is the Thomas team. Yes, so in the race, Buffalo is represented, in fact, because it's the Thomas Motor Company from Buffalo and the driver, George Schuster, who end up running the race on behalf of the Americans.
And what year is this?
All in 1908. So you have to kind of think back and set the stage a little bit. This would have been a time before streetlights. This is before gas stations on every corner. You don't have a lot of paved roads in the country. You don't have AAA if you break down. And I don't know if this maybe occurred, but the Bering Strait being frozen has to be in winter, right? So the entire race would have to be run throughout the winter. So you don't have snow plows.
A Buffalo winter.
A North American winter, a Russian winter. I mean, all of these things, they are absolutely pushing these things to the limits. This is, in many respects, an impossible race. I think even the car manufacturer did not think that they could successfully complete the race. The team driving it didn't think they could complete the race. And yet, not only did they successfully complete it, they won.
Oh my goodness. And they actually had someone in the car with them documenting the whole thing, right?
Yes, so this entire idea was a harebrained publicity scheme from Le Matin, which is a French newspaper, and the New York Times in America. They really wanted to sell newspapers, they wanted to do something splashy. What better than a 22,000-mile long endurance race? Just for the record, the average lifespan of a car at this point is 10,000 miles.
So they had everything going against them.
There was nothing going right. Let's start there. So the idea of this race was really to just push human endurance, mechanical endurance to the absolute limit. So they start the race in February of 1908. The idea being they're going to leave from New York, go upstate to Buffalo, and then due west to San Francisco in the snow.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
Let's talk about some of the challenges they face. I know there were many, but there's some pretty fun ones, right?
There are so many things they face. Almost immediately, the snow becomes an issue. As is reliable in New York State, there was a blizzard almost right away. Of the 6 teams that actually end up running the race, we have our first casualty coming right out of New York City. One of the French teams ends up pulling out because it was woefully unprepared for the race. Snow was too much for it. For the remaining teams, they had to put wooden planks down to be able to drive across the snow. So at points, they're barely making a couple of miles in a day. Yes. So the idea of the race was that it should take roughly 22 days to get from New York City to San Francisco. That was blown out of the water right away. The entire race ended up taking 169 days.
How were they prepared for that?
They weren't, and that's the crazy part about this car in particular. Thomas was such a late entry, they just pulled a model right off of the assembly line. They didn't specially design a car to run the race. So what ends up happening is, and then you'll notice as we look behind us, there's no windshield on this car.
Right.
There's no roof, and there's no heater. So they are doing this in a winter race, and it's an open top, and the wind is rushing into their faces. At one point, the mechanic literally has to hold his hands up to the driver's face to keep the wind from blowing across his face because it's so blisteringly cold.
Right.
The only 2 modifications they were able to make: they added extra fuel tanks so they could carry 125 gallons of gas, and a very rudimentary canvas top that they were able to kind of put over it to keep some of the wind out, but obviously that didn't help with windows or anything along those lines. So this car truly was what you would have had you been on a waiting list to get a Thomas Flyer, what would have shown up in your driveway.
Wow.
Exactly. And that's what they worked with. So in addition to the car, Thomas sent mechanic George Schuster, who was an assembly line overseer. He understood the car from the ground up. He was supposed to assist and serve as the mechanic because there are no service stations along this route. So if your car breaks down and you can't fix it, it's miles and miles to the next city for you to be able to get the help that you need or the parts that you need. So Schuster ends up becoming absolutely essential to the success of this team.
And is he from Buffalo?
He is. He is an employee of the Thomas Motor Company. In fact, allegedly, the only reason he agreed to even run the race is if Thomas agreed to give him a job for life. So job security,
Job
even in
security.
1908.
They knew what they were doing. Okay, let's fast forward. So they went through 3 continents. I'm sure, obviously, they faced the snow right off the bat. Did you say something about quicksand?
They do get stuck in a number of odd predicaments in Russia. There is a swamp, there is a bog, there is, in fact, a kind of quicksand-like circumstance that not just the American car ends up in, but the German car as well. And so they try to pull each other out of it. At one point, after they finally get off out of the bog that they're in, they end up popping a bottle of champagne on the hood of one of the cars. They have a little bit of a toast, and then they get right back to the race, and then they take off and they keep going. So there's certainly some moments of humor and levity in it, and then of course it's a race, so there's obviously competition and there's all sorts of things that they were doing to try to undercut each other. The European teams faced a lot of adversity in the American section of the race because they had the language barrier and people didn't want to help the European teams.
Right.
So they would help the American team and then they would intentionally make it harder on the Europeans. But then they get to Russia and everybody is at a disadvantage. Nobody speaks Russian. There's a great story of George Schuster and the guys, they're starving and so they're trying to find some place where they can get some beef, and so they don't speak Russian, so they're just going like this, mooing at people until finally somebody gets the message that they want some meat for dinner.
Yeah.
They get lost more times than I can count. In fact, there's one moment in which they really thought that the Schuster was going to overtake the Protos, which is the German car. And Schuster ends up taking a wrong turn, losing 17 hours.
Oh my
I mean,
goodness.
imagine taking a wrong turn and ending up someplace differently entirely, so yeah.
And we know the spoiler alert, Americans won the race. What did this mean for that time?
Well, first and foremost, you have to remember 1908, cars are really truly the plaything of the rich. The average price of a car was between $6,000 and $12,000 in 1908, which if we put that in today's money is about $180,000 to $360,000.
Wow.
So if you could imagine taking a Bentley on a joyride around the world and then driving it into a Siberian bog, that's kind of what we're talking about here, like just in terms of how utterly insane this sounds. But at the same time, for so many people who wouldn't have seen a practical value for a car, seeing this car not only run this race, but endure the conditions that it faced, carry the loads that it was carrying, and complete this impossible journey, it made the car so much more functional, and it kind of gave it a sense of durability that most people just didn't think was possible. So it completely changed people's perception of the automobile. Up until this point, people are traveling on public transportation or horses and buggies. So now to have cars be a practical, functional thing, and then later that year, Henry Ford introduces the Model T, you have the perfect confluence of a demand for cars and now the accessibility of buying one.
The marketing made itself.
It really did, and I think even if Henry Ford had introduced the Model T without this race, it would have taken so much longer for people to warm up to the idea and even think that they needed a car. But now seeing this car, and in many parts of America, having them drive through their towns and seeing them up close and appreciating, wow, this has so much more potential than we realized. Now all of a sudden it made more people, and especially people of maybe middle class means who could afford a Model T, but maybe not a Thomas Flyer at that time, it made them want to buy one. And it made it so that we kind of rebuilt our country to accommodate cars. And really, this is the impetus for that entire shift. So now you start to see the urban sprawl that we see. We also completely changed the infrastructure of our country to accommodate the automobile, the cars, the service stations, the interstate. I think the greatest testament to the lasting impact of the race is that when they build the first interstate, they build it the exact route from Times Square in New York City to San Francisco.
Wow.
Because that was the way that they went across the country, right? So there's certainly a lasting impact on it, but I think it really does completely change the American mindset and also catapult America as a car manufacturing nation on par with the European nations that had for so long dominated auto manufacturing.
Absolutely. And having the Ford plant right here in Buffalo had to be huge during that time.
Yes, and there are a number of them. So Pierce Arrow is in Buffalo, Thomas Motor Company is in Buffalo, and that also kind of gives rise to that Detroit, Cleveland, all of these industrial cities. We become automotive cities, and that shapes even Buffalo's history too.
It is amazing that we have this piece of history right here in Buffalo, here at the Pierce Arrow Museum. It's not going to be here for much longer, but there's still so much to do and see here, right?
Absolutely. I can't recommend visiting it enough. Right next to us are a number of cars manufactured by the Thomas Motor Company, so even if you miss seeing the flyer, you can still see some of the other automobiles manufactured by this very famous manufacturer. And directly opposite us is the Frank Lloyd Wright filling station, which is just absolutely stunning to be able to see in person.
Thanks so much for sharing that piece of history.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on to talk about it.
The Thomas Flyer is no longer on display at the Pierce Arrow Museum, but you can learn more about the other amazing pieces of history right here in the 716. If you like this story, then stay tuned as we are working on a regular history segment with Lindsay Besser that you can tune into here on Daytime Buffalo.